So for week 4, the topic was cultural transformations from 1450 to 1750, and there are a lot of them. Um, I'm not going to go through the questions right now. What I want to go to, though, is right here. These two things right here, Frankopan and Harari. Um, Very few of you used both of them, but they were both required, as well as, of course, your regular multimedia and whatever section of the textbook you were using. Um, Using the required readings, the other sources, discuss the ways in which the new global economics and politics changes cultures. In what ways do these things change for the average person anywhere in the world? Are these changes better or worse? Why? What cultures are changed the most and why? Which ones the least and why? Which changes have the most impact on us today and why? The least and why? Were these changes inevitable? Why or why not? Okay, before I even get into addressing those questions, let's talk about your sourcing. If you were using Bentley, Strayer Nelson, Von Sivers, Cordas, all of these have different points of view. Frankopan, excuse me, and Harari are both focusing very much on how Europe is transformed culturally, but also how that impacts the rest of the world. And that's really kind of the heart of where I was going with this. Um, those of you who are using von Sivers or looking at Bentley or Strayer Nelson all got the thing on the Reformation, the Renaissance, the new structures created by the wars in primarily Western Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants. And be careful when you're talking about the Protestants because there are a lot of them. And in the same way that the Catholics and the Protestants didn't get along, most of the Protestants and their different orthodoxies didn't get along either. So there's a lot of warfare and chaos. That's one of the things that Frankopan and Harari both mention in terms of what drives Europeans to begin to rise to the top. And as Harari points out in his chapter, the Europeans bring something to the table that other cultures don't, and that is a curiosity about science and about exploration, but along with it, a curiosity about weaponry and about um, conquering more than anything else. So before I even go into a discussion of the questions, I want to go through Frankopan. His chapter opens with a discussion of the rise of the English, and his chapter is chapter 13, Road to Northern Europe. Um, it discusses very much how, in what is referred to in English history as the Golden Age of Elizabeth I, but also the Golden Age of England rising to the top as the dominant Protestant power, and in that way having to control itself or compete with both the Spanish and the French, who are competing amongst themselves to be the most Catholic nation. So um, that he talks a lot about how the English desire to remain independent of Catholic control was a big part of the drive for them to explore. And he brings up a lot of the different explorers that are primarily English. If you're looking at pages 240 and 241, he's talking about Hakluyt and about the Indies, about how the printing press allows for de las Casas's work on the destruction of the Indies to be not only published in multiple forms, but also to be translated. So the British had an idea about that as well. He also, Frankman also brings up, though, the discussion of England's relations with places like China, their relations with the Ottoman Empire. He's talking about England literally trying to come out in the world. And through a lot of this, his chapter is literally talking about how Europeans are competing with each other. He talks about the Dutch and the creation of one of the largest and most efficient companies, the VOC, which you'll read a lot about in your textbooks as well, because the VOC actually becomes the paradigm that other English companies want to create, and the English eventually will. But it is the idea of using an actual company as a mechanism for a political entity to control a colony, because that's what the VOC does. And the Dutch spread out very quickly, taking the Portuguese model of the trading post empire, but turning it more into the control of smaller territories in South Asia and in Indonesia. Again, that's going to become the model for later for what the British do in India, in the British East India Company. On page 250, Frankopan opens a discussion of warfare, though, with European warfare, however, had an even more important role. It prompted the rise of the West. And this again goes to this idea of West versus East, which we sort of talked about last week. And this is basically where the European ideas are going to become central to how we view the world today, which is a big part of what that last part of the question was about. Discussions about Europe in this period emphasize that the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason saw a coming of age where ideas of absolutism were replaced by notions of freedom, rights, and liberty. But it was Europe's entrenched relationship with violence and militarism that allowed it to place itself in the center of the world after the great expeditions of the 1490s. He goes on from there to discuss different discoverers and how they took control. And through all of this, the recurrent theme is the way the Europeans are going to use science and technology literally to take control of everything. On page 254, he goes through a discussion of the economics. One reason for the rise to prominence of London and Amsterdam was the socioeconomic acceleration of Northern Europe. The latest research suggests that the population almost doubled in England and the Low Countries between 1500s and 1800. Most of the growth was felt in densely populated areas where the numbers of large towns rose by nearly 3 times. So this is going to be part of how your culture is going to shift. We're going to see a move away from agriculture and more towards urbanization. It's going to lay the groundwork for the workers of the Industrial Revolution. And it's not a coincidence that in the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution begins, and it begins in England. Now, going to Harari, The Marriage of Science and Empire, he's going to take on a similar theme. It's the idea, starting on page 175, the very first part of the chapter, that while Europeans were out there colonizing, one of the things that drove them was curiosity. And a lot of the stories he has in this chapter are about individual discoverers and how they found what they found and what that meant. But it also has a lot to do with the sending of scientific expeditions into areas that they are colonizing. And that their curiosity about things the people there living in those areas had seen all their lives and not really thought anything about is a big part of what he says is the European view that makes Europeans different from everywhere else. And he calls it cultural. In fact, at the very end of the chapter, and I love this particular end of the chapter, on page 303. Actually, I want to go back. Well, he's talking about linguistic theory and how it arises, and doing this basically because some of this curiosity had to do with learning to translate ancient languages into languages that could be understood today, right? So he goes through a lot of that with the scientists there, because he's talking about Mohenjo-Daro, which is a very ancient city, one of the first cities and cultures that we know of in northern India. We know very little about it because we don't know anything about how to read the writings we have from them. But he's talking about how Mohenjo-Daro was actually discovered, and it was discovered because a European, an Englishman actually, was traipsing in the area and found the ruins of the city, ruins that the people, again, living there had known about all of their lifetimes and the lifetimes of their parents and grandparents, etc., and not had a curiosity about. Um, so on page 303 at the top, it starts with, in Europe, on the other hand, the Aryans preserved their racial purity. This is why Europeans had managed to conquer the world and why they were fit to rule it, provided they took precautions not to mix with inferior races. Such racist theories, prominent and respectable for many decades, have become anathema among scientists and politicians alike. People continue to conduct a heroic struggle against racism without noticing that the battlefront has shifted and that the place of racism in imperial ideology has now been replaced by what he calls culturism. There is no such word, but it's about time we coined it. Among today's elites, assertions about the contrasting merits of diverse human groups are almost always couched in terms of historical differences between cultures rather than biological differences between races. We no longer say it's in their blood, we say it's in their culture. I would point to you the issues of immigration in the United States today, as well as other attitudes involving the war in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, the wars in the Ukraine, and other areas, and how we still use culture as a term to explain things when in truth it doesn't. It's just, again, it's another language word that's been taken and converted. Thus, European right-wing parties which oppose Muslim immigration usually take care to avoid racial terminology. And I'm not going to go through all this, but it's a really good example, especially if you're looking at today's. Harari, though, again, is talking very much about throughout this chapter, about the merging of the mentality of conquest, as he says on page 283, and scientific curiosity, and how that literally changes the nature of the world as a whole, because it is through that that the Europeans justify a lot of their dominance of the world during this period from 1450 to 1750 and even later. All right, so going back then to the questions themselves, many of you jumped right straight into global economics. Well, we did that last week. This week is about culture and how culture changes. So again, and I mentioned this in last week's discussion of the discussion, when you see things like in what ways do things change for the average person, you need to define who the average person is throughout the world at this point. And I would point out that from 1450 to 1750, the average person, despite Frankopan's discussion of the rise in the birth rate and the rise in urbanization, the average person is still somebody growing food or producing a commodity to be sold. So it's still basically an agriculturalist in some capacity. So how do things change for them? Well, Frankopan talks about the price revolution. And your textbooks will also, to a certain extent, discuss the way that the economics are changing. And in many ways, it's not for the better. For many people, the quality of life diminishes because suddenly they are no longer able to buy as much because of the massive inflation that starts with the Spanish bringing in gold and silver from the Western Hemisphere, but it grows as the Western Hemisphere and then Africa and then parts of Southeast Asia and then Asia itself and then India are all colonized and turned into areas for the mass production of goods. And that mass production of goods and its specialization drives the price of things down, but it also means that there's less money for people to work with. There's a direct relationship in there. So for the average person, things kind of go down. If you were an average person in the Western Hemisphere or Africa or Southeast Asia, your standard of living went way down because you either became enslaved or you became controlled literally by Europeans, even to the nature of your very freedom. What cultures are changed the most and why? Well, there are a lot of different ways you could look at this. From my own academic background, I would certainly say Native American and African cultures were changed the most because contact with Europeans and with other peoples effectively made them subject peoples. And by that, I mean literally enslaved or worse. But you could also argue that Europeans were changed the most because they were uh, going through the Reformation, the religious wars, and then the um, shift change, severe and swift changes brought about by the new economics, right? They're all very competitive. They want to get out there. They want to get everything. Which ones were changed the least and why? Well, both Harari and Frankopan mention that the ones that actually kind of change the least are the Asian and Near Eastern kingdoms. China, particularly, Harari does a really good job talking about how China sends Zheng He out, but then even though at that point in time in the early to mid 1400s, China obviously had the technological advantage on everywhere else in the world. If you look again at the size of Zheng He's boats versus those of Columbus, there's no question but that they had a massive technological advantage over everywhere else. But at the end of those voyages, and in fact, actually to end those voyages, the emperor recalls Zheng He and basically gives up on any curiosity about the rest of the world, limiting his interest to his own empire as it is, not to expanding it, not to control anything, but just maintaining it as it is. And that's going to become central to the way the Ming, particularly, um, view China. So they don't remain curious. They don't develop more and different technologies to compete with the West. They don't even adopt Western technologies. And thus, because of that, it puts them at a disadvantage when the Europeans do come knocking on their door um, and eventually forcing them to become a subject people. Similar with the Safavid Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, both of which had been very curious up till about that point in time, but then they in turn become more self-directed and self-centered, considering themselves to be um, elite and at the pinnacle of where they wanted to be. But because of that, they also are unready when the Europeans show up. Which changes have the most impact on us today and why? Culturally, well, I think this, again, the slavery, subjugation of colonized peoples, colonization itself, had a massive effect on where we are in the world today. The fact that we still deal with issues of racism and culturalism and inequality, a lot of that stems directly from this period of time and the way the Europeans viewed things. Which changes impact us today the least? Interestingly, and I think someone argued this in one of the discussion points, religion. While religion was critical during the 1450s to 1750s period and later, the religious wars, particularly in Europe, but also in parts of the Islamic world, as the Sunni and Shia were also fighting. You know, see, in fact, that's one of the differences between the Safavid Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The Safavids were Shia and the Ottomans were Sunni, so they never merged together because they were directly opposed to the other's religious philosophies. The same thing was happening in Western Europe. So religion, which was huge then, is probably less significant to us today throughout most of the Western world, throughout most of the Western world. Um, were these changes inevitable? And a lot of you didn't even address that. Um, that's an opinion question. It requires you, though, to support it with hopefully a combination of ideas from Harari, Frankopan, your multimedia, and factual information from your textbook. So, all right, so I'm going to repeat something I said last week. Your peer comments should be substantive, which means they should bring either new ideas and or new historical examples into the discussion somewhere along the way. You should not be repeating what you said in your top post, nor should you be repeating what someone else said in their top post to which you're responding. They should be unique and individual comments designed literally to demonstrate your comprehensive understanding of what's going on. Citation in them is mandatory. So if you write a peer comment and you don't think there's anything in to cite, then you're not making a substantive peer comment, and therefore you're going to get a low grade or a zero. I'm at the point now where I'm like, okay, if this is not bringing anything new into the thing, you're kind of wasting everyone's time with that peer comment. So you need to be thinking about that as you address your peer comments. Again, they need to be on 3 different days. Just don't have a lot of you doing them on one day. Um, and they need to include that citation. I'm also going to point out that I'm not negotiating about the issue of sourcing. You need to have your textbook in there for the historical examples. You need to have Harari and Frankopan or whatever other required ones are in there, and you need to have that multimedia. Very few of you used a multimedia in this past discussion. Very few of you used both Harari and Frankopan. So let's stay on that. There's a reason I'm doing this. If you've got really broad statements with no historical support, then you're not demonstrating to me that you're paying attention to what we're doing or that you're reading the material. So be sure you think about that. Be sure that you address these thoroughly. This is week 4 that we've just finished, that I just sent you back the grades for. We're now moving into week 5, which means we literally are 1/3 of the way through the course. And if you're not getting these grades the way you need them, you need to start reading my comments and thinking about what I'm saying in the discussion post that I'm returning to you and getting this stuff nailed down, because we're past the point where grades are not going to count. I drop your 3 lowest ones, but a lot of you, instead of going up, as you should be, are going down. And that is not a good thing. If you have questions, if you don't understand what you're supposed to be doing with this, let me know. I'm going to mention again, also, you're not supposed to be using AI. If you're using AI and Turnitin demonstrates that to me, then you're not only going to get a 0, you're going to get marked as someone to be reported for student misconduct. So please don't use the AI. Do the work yourself. All right, on that note, let's see, the week 5 discussion is on the Atlantic revolutions. And this is something many of you will find interesting, I think, because sorry, I'm not sure why it's not running, because it brings us into the modern world. Those of you who've wanted to focus more on the development of the United States and the history that seems more relevant to you about us, stuff that you actually obviously know probably better, this will be where we begin to start picking that up. This is the Enlightenment Revolutions 1.0, because these are the first ones. It's not just the US, it's the US, France, Haiti, and then we'll pick up some also with the Latin American revolutions, but they're all revolutions in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe itself, because there are some evolving nations in Europe. We're beginning to see the decline in monarchies and the rise of more democratic governments in Western Europe particularly. So there's talk of those as well. So for this week, this is your question, what they are. Your required readings, again, right through here, the textbook itself, but also Frankopan's chapter 15, Harari's chapter 16, and a discussion of settler colonialism, which I encourage you to look at, as well as a typology of colonialism by Shoemaker. These are very, very good sources, and they're going to help you to understand a lot of the terminology I'm going to be using for the rest of the course. So, a lot to read this week. Due, of course, by Thursday night. If you're going to be late, you need to let me know why, or you're going to start losing those, or you're going to be losing those points. Many of you already have lost those points. And losing 40% on a discussion post simply because you can't post it on time, that's a lot to lose. All right, if you have questions, email me and let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the discussions tomorrow. Thank you.